All right, what is T? T is usually considered a stock issue. I say usually because all parts of debate are debatable, even topicality itself and its necessity for the debate. It's usually considered a prima facie burden. I highly recommend that when you look at a judging philosophy, you look at how they evaluate topicality, because topicality means a lot of different things to a lot of different critics. And the way in which they evaluate it can be quite different. And I'll cover a couple of those things. So topicality as an argument focuses on syntax and semantics of the resolution. Okay? The term syntax refers to the grammatical structure of the resolution, whereas semantics refers to the vocabulary definition of the word. Okay? The reason for this is obviously words are somewhat debatable in the resolution, right? Like we are given this resolution and expected to debate upon it, or possibly not. And so the resolution is providing a locus for the debate, right? And if these words didn't have meaning and didn't have to both teams, then there would be a certain arguments would not make sense in going forward into the debate. So that's usually why topicality is referenced first in the debate as an opposition strategy. So again, topicality is an argument that's based on the plan's position to the resolution. The plan itself on a case will have to directly meet the resolution. So for that, I mean, there's a certain amount of parametrics that happen. We're giving very broad resolutions, right? The United States should intervene in Syria. Okay, what does that mean? There are a lot of different types of intervention. Where exactly in Syria, right? Like, what type of force would be, considered an intervention as opposed to just a diplomatic expose, I guess, into Syria. So this is about seeking to limit the debate, right? And the question really becomes an issue of space, not an issue of the words themselves. So what exactly is the debate that's happening? In a lot of debates, you are debating a specific warrant argument structure. That is not necessarily the case with topicality. You are debating a space of existence. You're debating whether something should or should not exist. So on the app, you have this resolutional space, right, that you think is true. And that there's a plan that fits within that resolutional space, right? On the negative, you are making arguments there is a counter-resolutional space. There is a resolutional space in which the plan does not exist, all right? So because of this, arguments back and forth, the locus for the arguments always deal with the plan, but your warrants and evidence will come from this space that is defined. So let's talk about a typical structure for a T argument. Typical structure consists of a definition. This is, again, semantic meaning, right? It can be one word or a group of words. For example, I would probably define the United States federal government, if I needed to, as a term, right? Or in Syria as a term. I'll go through a couple examples in a second, but the violation is just reasons why the plan doesn't meet your interpretation of the definition, okay? This is not to say that their plan doesn't violate it in multiple ways. Lots of good topicality violations are multi-layered, right? There can be more than one way in which someone does not do something, or they do too much. Standards just means the warrants for why you should prefer the definition or the interpretation for the debate. The voting issues are the impacts, right? They're the reasons why the judge cares. Okay, without these, topicality doesn't make any sense, right? Because if there is not a reason to reject them at an entire level, there is not a reason to reject them from the debate. And because of that, I see lots of people mess this up. I see lots of people very gloss over the voting issues. I see lots of people forget voting issues later in the debate. And it becomes super problematic for a judge to evaluate, whether or not the plan should be rejected on the basis of where its position is to the resolution, when they have no idea what they are trying to evaluate as to whether or not that's a good idea. And I'll cover that a little bit later too. I've included a new category here. This is something that's kind of developed within the community over the past 3 years. I'm calling it evaluation, and it's a framework to evaluate topicality. And by that I mean there are many ways to evaluate arguments in general. So where does topicality come in the, how do you evaluate this type of argument? And the most common is competing interpretations. And that just means you look at the two definitions, see which standards and warrants are better, and then you pick that definition. I'll cover why that's kind of problematic a little bit later. So let's do an example of a T. All right, so the resolution is the United States federal government should substantially increase its support of the United Nations peacekeeping operations. It's a resolution in 05 for cross-examination debate. I've underlined 3 sections that are arguably going to be contentious from a topicality perspective. Substantially increase. There's lots of legal literature about what a substantial increase is from the current status quo. Support is a very broad term. There can be many different definitions of support for this type of resolution. And then peacekeeping operations. There is a lot of literature as to the type and nature of peacekeeping operations, the extent of what actually a peacekeeping operation is. Does it have to be defined as a peacekeeping operation by the United Nations, or can it just be a peacekeeping operation without the UN blessing, which has happened before? So in this instance, we'll just pick a plan, all right? The United States will provide logistical support for the United Nations peacekeeping forces in the Congo. Just to give you a background about that. Congo has a ton of child soldiers, as well as Sierra Leone. There's a massive internal tribal fighting that occurs within that region as well. And there's blue helmets, which means that there's essentially a non-violent peacekeeping force that is always present within the Congo. They've been there for like 34 years, something like that. So the most important thing about topicality debates is choosing your terms very, very carefully. This is the easiest way to lose or a topicality debate before you even begin, is you define the wrong word. We'll talk about that a little bit later as well. But in this instance, I think the clearest one that can be debated is peacekeeping operations. And I'll show you why. So the definition, peacekeeping operations means more than one operation, right? The violation is the plan only acts in the Congo. There is a ton of literature to indicate that peacekeeping operations is a plural term applying to all UN peacekeeping operations. There's also a ton of literature that says that peacekeeping operations is a singular and plural noun, so it's highly debatable within the realm of topicality. When I was debating this topic, I probably had, 30 or 40 pages outlining the difference between when it's plural and when it's not plural. And in that type of resolution, it could definitely be both. So the standards, right? The 2 most common standards are ground and limits, okay? Ground is that the plan eliminates disadd links or counterplan links or other types of specific arguments that deal with UN-based action in any other country, right? So if it was a plural operations and it affected all of this current 16 peacekeeping operations, like in the Ivory Coast and Israel-Palestine, et cetera, that's lots of negative ground that kind of disappears when I can specify down to the Congo, right? The other type of argument that is generalized is limits. And this is a spacing argument. So remember, I told you we're debating about a resolutional space. And the limits seek to tell the judge why your space is a good space. And so the limits is the AF interpretation explodes specificity of action instead of holistic UN support structure, right? So it's very different to support a peacekeeping operation as opposed to the United Nations peacekeeping operations, which are, vast, right? The structure that you use, the funding, the way that support occurs is very, very different. And the arguments that are present within those 2 different spaces are delineatable, okay? Voting issues. So I've put 2 up here that are fairly common that you'll see, which is education and fairness. So education, usually the warrant for why this is a voting issue, has something to do along the lines of the resolution itself needs integrity, otherwise the educational value of the activity goes away. Like, if the resolution was not providing education, why do we debate, kind of thing, right? So if we don't have that at least metric for, wanting a ballot to preserve the educational value of the activity, then we should preserve that. The next one is fairness. And fairness is around providing reasonable debate ground for both sides. Now remember, this is different than equity, right? Like separate but equal is not equal, right? So fairness looks to kind of a moral statement about providing equal access and reasonable access to both sides of the debate. So if I was able to specify so far down, say to one peacekeeping operation, I have not reasonably provided enough ground for the negative to engage the debate, right? And when the negative gets isolated from the debate also collapses. So these are arguments that are predicated on the nature and structure of the resolution and how we should evaluate that. Notice that education and fairness are slightly similar to ground and limits. They should be fairly intuitive because ground and limits are what you're using as warrants to provide access to the impact of education and fairness. Evaluation. Usually, this is competing interpretations. It's got cut off. Is this good? Oh, nice. Okay. Competing interpretations. You should evaluate definitions by standards comparison, or there's a lot of other terms that happen and ways that it is said. But again, it's just comparing ground and limits to whatever other definition and ground and limit standard they give, and then the clash that happens there on an argument level. So definitions. I'm going to break these each up by substructure and kind of outline where you can get warrants and how to prep the argument. So definitions can come from a variety of different sources. Okay, there are your typical dictionary definitions, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, these are the definitions. In a lot of instances, especially in this style of debate, I highly recommend just using contextual definitions, right? Like, you don't want to be, unless you have to, defining terms like it's or Syria, right? You don't want to define it by literally geographical coordinates, right? You want to take a contextual definition, say like peacekeeping operations, and provide the actual context for that type of definition, right? Support in the context of military actions means fairly specific things. Support in everyday English means just to help out, right? That's not really where your definitions want to go. The more specific, the better. The more resolutionally intact, the better. So they're not only specific, but they're multifaceted. Lots of times, people will just kind of spit out a very specific type of definition, but will not kind of nuance the extent of the definition. So in the peacekeeping operations example, we can use a support example. Support in a military context can usually mean logistic, military, or diplomatic support. So there's 3 very different types of support that can happen, and you can nuance off of that and not just off of support. A very important issue, wow, it's a large book. Make sure that your definition retains grammatical integrity. Do not switch a verb to a noun when you are defining it. It causes a ton of confusion. It should always meet the replace and retain standard. You should literally be able to take out the word, put in your definition, reread the topic, and it make complete sense. If it doesn't, something's probably wrong. Violations. Okay. I know that in prep, you are making a couple violations that you think are going to happen. It is very important that while you are reading in the LO your Topicality definition, you make your violation specific to the app, right? Any level of specificity for the violation is going to make your Topicality violation significantly better. The reason for this is it prevents shifting that I see a lot in Topicality debates. They'll provide a violation and then it'll kind of morph throughout the debate. And the more specific to the AF you are, the less that it shifts and the more structure and integrity your argument is going to have with the rest of the debate. Violations should also get you somewhere, right? They're going to have to engage this argument. The AF is going to need to answer this, right? But their arguments might be able to get you somewhere, like say a link to a disad or a necessary concession for an argument. Like if you need to get them to say, no, we put boots on the ground, and that's a hard link to intervention for your criticism, you're going to need to have a level of topicality protection that gets them to physically say that. So you want them to provide maybe an opposite definition that you can just concede and move on, so that all of your other links for the debate make sense. Also, you can make violations specific to the definition you gave. I see a lot of times people read a definition, then think of a violation that does not directly engage the definition. The reason for that is you defined the wrong word. If there is not a clear reason why your violation and definition link, there is obviously a lacking necessity for evaluating the topicality that makes it just inherently difficult to evaluate. Standards. So I've talked about grounded limits and the space that exists for those. So I've outlined, grounds are just any type of argument that augments the space, the arguments that exist in the space that you are defining, okay? The limits are just the size of the space. So there's a lot of things like depth and breadth, and you'll hear a lot of subsets of these two styles of argument. I can't go into all of the different styles. In general, it's either ground or limits. Bright line is a little unique. Bright line just says when you know you're in or out of the space. That's helpful for a critic when evaluating, like, yes, you are topical, no, you're not topical. Right? Terms of art. These are preferences for specific types of definitions. So there can be warrants as to why a common definition is good in this instance, or why a context-specific definition is good. So we can make arguments about that. And then finally, the last subset is grammar arguments. These are the, noun position means that this is the only type of syntactical sense of the resolution. You convert a verb to an adjective. It's clearly a verb. If it's a verb, then it must have this definition. So you have essentially 5 different types of standards. They come in a variety of different flavors that someone will probably else cover in another T lecture. But arguments in the space, size of the space, knowing if you are in the space, the where you got the space question, where you got the definition, and does the definition make sense, does the space make sense in the context of the resolution? Voting issues. Okay, there's around four. They come in, again, a variety of different flavors. Fairness, right? This is preserving debate for access reasons. If debate's not fair, then someone doesn't have access to the debate, whether that be the negative or future debaters down the line. Education, just making arguments that the resolution is providing a good aspect to an educational value. Ground. Okay, this is also a standard, but in general, when reading judging philosophies, there will be a lot of talk about abuse, right? And there has to be realized or potential abuse. Realized abuse is when, they read kind of a wanky case and then all of your offense just gets spiked out. And the reason it's wanky is because they're defining a word super bizarrely. Like support means to, give everyone candy bars, right? And then everyone will be super happy for voting elections day and they're all gonna vote for this specific candidate, right? And you're gonna read a definition on support, saying, no, it must be one of these 3 things or one of these 1 things. And then they're going to be like, no, we don't have to do that, and then spike out of all of your disads, or that counterplan doesn't work. That's the abuse that I'm talking about, right? That is a reason to reject them in a lot of critics' eyes, because a lot of critics want the debate to happen. They want the argument clash to happen. And when the affirmative is spiking out of your arguments just predicated off of the way they're defining a word, topicality is what protects you against that. Finally, jurisdiction, which is honestly the one that makes the most sense to me as just a critic preference. To me, topicality is just a rule of the game. Like, if you're not topical, you should probably lose. Like, I just think it has nothing. I don't know why debates aren't educational in and of themselves. Like, to me, that seems non-unique in any instance. Fairness, if you don't know it right now, debate is not fair. It's just not. It's never fair. So the first two just don't make any sense to me, really. I understand the abuse one. Like, okay. Jurisdiction for me is just like a rule-based integrity. Like, literally the MPDA and MPT rules say you need to be topical. I think it's like section 5.3C or something like that, right? It's like the affirmative must present a topical reason to affirm the resolution or something like that. And this also makes a ton of sense in like legal argument too. Like, if a judge doesn't have jurisdiction to rule on a case, they throw it out, right? Or if they, you bring criminal charges to a civil trial, those arguments are literally not evaluated. Also, the way that you evaluate evidence is very different in those two different types of courts. So there's just a lot of precedence in the way that the legal system works as to why jurisdiction makes sense in a specific wording instances. Okay, evaluation. Again, competing interpretations is by far the most common that it's occurring in our community. The other one is reasonability, that you only need to be reasonably topical in order to meet the definition, because there's a lot of different definitions, right? My biggest thing here is danger on competing interpretations. What I've seen is that a negative will read topicality and they'll say evaluate on competing interpretations, and they'll be like, it's a voting issue, right? And it's like, okay, great. Here's another definition. 80 reasons why that definition's better. You said topicality is a voting issue. I win topicality. I win the debate. I've seen this happen twice. So just, word of caution that I have seen people concede that topicality should be evaluated competing interpretations, concede that topicality should come first, and then just win the T debate. So pick your poison.
So you're saying don't give an interpretation?
No, I'm just warning you that I've seen that happen, right? If you are making arguments that topicality is a voting issue and that competing interpretations is the way to evaluate that, and you are asking for a ballot on the basis of topicality, you are running the risk of someone just conceding that is the most important issue for the debate to preserve fairness and educational access, and tell you why their definition is, better. So it's not to scare you away. I'm just warning you that argument is probably coming. And then sometimes I hear a red light, green light standard that topicality is a yes/no question, which means that it's not an evaluation really of the argument. Well, it is an evaluation of the arguments, but you can't reasonably win the argument. You either win it or you don't, right? So you're either topical or you're not. You're not pseudo-topical. Special types of T, I'm briefly going to go over this. I'm going to ask other people to go over this in other T lectures. I'm going to add an advanced T lecture later. But there are two different subtypes. Generally, there's FX topicality and extra topicality, and people get these two confused all of the time. Okay, so FX topicality is effectually topical. This means that the plan action doesn't directly influence the resolution. Okay? This means that your plan has to solve in order for you to be topical. Okay, so one instance that I've seen is, let's take this peacekeeping operations one. The United States federal government will create a rapid reaction force of 10,000 troops to deploy to peacekeeping operations. That is FX topical because it requires peacekeeping operations to exist and for the troops to be deployed before you have any access to supporting the United Nations, right? Just the physical creation of the force does not meet the resolution, right? It requires the deployment, which the plan does not do. Another issue that I've seen is just the United States federal government will fund $100 million to NGOs to go and help peacekeeping operations. The United States is not directly supporting the peacekeeping operation. They are supporting the NGO, and then the NGO is supporting the peacekeeping operation. You can understand why this is super problematic because the AF is going to get up and say, I don't link to any relations-based DISAD. I only operate within NGOs. So I don't link to any United Nations arguments. I don't, and also I get access to all these NGO arguments that are definitely outside of the resolution. So the most important thing about FX topicality is it still requires a definition. I see tons of people be like, yes, you know, you take multiple steps to get to being topical, but they don't read a definition. Okay, pick a definition that makes sense that they violate, right? It's probably in this instance support, right? Support is providing X, X, and X. They do not directly do X, X, and X, right? The standards that are kind of unique to FX topicality are plan and vacuum and mixing burdens. Plan and vacuum means you need to look at plan text against the resolution and evaluate if plan directly meets the resolution. In the instance of the NGO one, it's fairly clear that, you know, plan text does not directly support the UN, right? You have a textual line that says you're going to go to the NGOs as opposed to the United Nations. And then mixing burdens. Mixing burdens just means they are mixing the burden of being topical with the notion of solvency, right? These two things are separate. Otherwise, if you mix these burdens, then I could just read anything that I wanted to on the app, get solvency for something, and then claim I'm topical, right? I could have as many steps as I want. So there's a notion of these two things must be independent. One is prima facie, you have to on-face meet it, right? That's topicality, versus the notion of solvency, which is a fluid continuum of being able to answer something. Yes?
So basically, in essence, this is kind of like a multi-fiat abuse kind of thing? Like they're
yeah, it's very similar.
Okay,
yeah.
all right.
Multi-fiat.
It's like we're going to give NGOs money and then the NGOs are going to do this.
Yeah, I mean, multi-actor fiat is...
Is this a better way of
Think about
going
it more in terms of the level of steps to get to solvency. And it's not to say that levels of steps to get to solvency is a bad thing. I think that most cases have multiple layers of getting to solvency, right? Like there's a lot of, you know, ways in which that can be employed. It is the fact that solvency is required in order to be topical. I have to get solvency as opposed to win topicality. That should never be in question. I should not have to defend that my action gets completed. I should on-face be topical. I should on-face support a UN peacekeeping operation or a UN peacekeeping operations, right? United States, direct peacekeeping operations. There are multiple steps to there, and I have to win those steps, then that's a question of solvency.
If I say FX topicality, could a critic know that?
It depends on the philosophy. Normally, I don't label it FX topicality. The standards that are that you provide, it's very clear, you know, why you're providing them, right? Plan and vacuum. The warrants are you take, you know, look at these things and then do that. This is fairly special. I do not recommend running this type of argument in front of critics that are not as familiar with the stock issues, if that makes sense. Just because this kind of debate is going to get very, 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 very technical. Right? I guarantee you that, well, I say this with like 80% certainty, the people that are using FX topicality to get to solvency, or using solvency to get to topicality, are doing it for a reason. They're using it to spike out of disads and counterpoints. They are strategically choosing to do this, right? So you need to punish them for that, right? What I'll also say is that FX topicality deserves a little bit more respect in time allocation than just your normal topicality, because it's one of those things where you would probably have to do 8 minutes of it in the MO and 4 minutes of it in the LOR to like nail the coffin down, right? Because at the point in which you concede FX topicality, the argument goes away and they get to spike out of all of your offense, right? So this is why a lot of critics have the ground potential abuse standard, right? Like they don't want this kind of debate to happen, and this is the theory argument to protect you from it. Extra topicality. Okay. Not the same as FX. Alright. Extra topicality is when the plank goes outside of the resolution. These are kind of like picks, only on the app, if you know what that is. Basically, you take being 100% solvent and then you add other things to claim advantages off of them. So, for example, the United States will provide, 10,000 troops, UN peacekeeping forces deploying Congo, totally topical, and sign all of this international law, treaty stuff, law of the seas, will sign the Gender Convention, etc., etc., etc. Right? And then they claim advantages off them. You're like, whoa, that's a lot of new offense. There's a lot of different interpretations as to why they should or should not lose the debate, they should get access to arguments, damage done, etc., etc. Someone else will go into this. I just want you to be aware that these two things are different, and we'll cover that a bit later. So, with some of the remaining time, I mostly do prep drills and stuff with my debaters, so I thought it would be good for us to do prep drills for topicality. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a resolution that were done a couple years ago. And then you'll have 5 minutes to complete the T-shell, right? So all the parts, right? And then I'm going to give you a plan that was run by the affirmative. And then you can either fill in the blanks to your T-shell, provide additional warrants as to why that case meets or does not meet it. Or you might have to completely write a new T-shell, because some of these plans are just absolutely not topical, and you kind of need to figure out on the fly why it's not topical. This is one of the hardest things to do. You will be listening to an app going, there is no way this is topical, and then having to write a T-shell on the fly. It's not a ton of fun, but it's definitely a skill that can be developed. So, yeah.
Now, as far as, you didn't really go over interpretation, so are you recommending that we do make up an alternate definition to the words? Like if they say limit and they're saying let's say it's 20%, we're no, the limit should be 50%, just as an example. Do we do that? Or should we say, look, they don't limit enough and just move on?
No, you should definitely
give an alternate.
Give an alternate.
Okay.
I'm not focusing on answering topicality.
Okay.
Alex is giving that lecture in a couple days. I'm just focused on creating topicality, types of arguments you run on topicality, the warrants for that. Answering it is going outside of that. So this exercise is just specific to provide a definition, provide an interpretation, provide standards, provide the voting issues you're going to go for, and the type of evaluation. And you should be able to do that within 5 minutes. I'm giving you 5 minutes specifically because that's how long it should take you in prep to write this argument. Right? Okay. So, 5 minutes on clock. The resolution is the European Union should intervene in Syria. And I can go around and help you. You got it?
Yeah. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions about that?
These standards are preferences to your meaning, right?
Yes.
What word do you think you need to define?
Well, I'm not sure because I don't have a plan yet, but I'm assuming that I'll be going for intervene.
Okay, so what's your definition of intervene going to be?
This is a really important point, is that you don't necessarily need to know the plain text in order to prepare topicality definitions, right? You can have modular T definitions, right? You can have two different forms of the T violation too, right? You can have one version that says in Syria means a physical location. You could also have the opposite definition of is a theoretical, area which contains the government, right? So you could give geographical coordinates, or you could go more high theory, depending, right? And then you bring both of those into the round, and whatever one they don't do, you read the other one. Okay, about 30 seconds.
Do you ever recommend saying a priori?
A priori, it's not really necessary in this format.
Okay.
Okay. All right, let's do a check. Do you have all the components? Is there a definition, violation, standards, voting issue, and evaluation on your sheet of paper? Remember, your sheet of paper might be handed to your partner. Therefore, all of these things should be labeled. Do your standards make sense to the definition that you gave? And did you provide warrants for voting issues as opposed to just stating them? It's a voting issue. So I'm guessing, by show of hands, most of you decided to do intervene as your definition, yeah? Can I get some definitions, just to,
To take action inside the country of Syria to foster change from status quo.
okay, so that contains too many parts.
Okay.
You're gonna want intervene to be much more compact. Intervene means to create,
Inside change.
create, governmental change to create governmental change. Any other definitions of intervene? Yep.
I actually kind of had a question.
Sure.
So I was looking at it and defining intervene, but I'm almost not sure if my definition fits in more than intervene, because I feel like there's a lot of ways to intervene, but the real deal breaker is that it's supposed to be physically in Syria, and I feel like that physical location is best defined by in and actually not intervene. So would like that, I guess, topicality like preempt be more fitting for in or intervene?
So in is definitely a definition that you will see in a second as to why it should be provided.
Okay.
There is a definition of intervene, though, that kind of gets to that point. And very commonly, intervene is defined as boots on the ground. That's actually a military term. So when when the Army talks about intervening, they mean physical soldiers in a place, right? So in Syria, it's just the geographical location where those boots hit the ground, but the intervention itself, if you defined it like that, would be, from the Army, this is how they qualify it, et cetera, et cetera. Another, yeah?
I also kind of had a similar issue because, like, when you say intervene, wouldn't imposing sanction, is it not also intervening? And then, like...
Okay, so how are you going to define intervene?
Well, I just think...
I mean, I don't disagree with you.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
right? This is why topicality is a debate to be had, right?
Yeah.
Like, I can definitely see an app getting up and being like, we're going to sanction Syria. That's why you should probably have a definition of intervene means physical troops, if that's what your disads are based off, right? Topicality is to get you somewhere, right? If they read sanctions and all of your prep is, the EU should send in boots to the ground or do airstrikes or, kind of having that modular, you need topicality to protect you from that, subset of sanctions arguments.
Okay.
So you're going to want your T definition to be something like that. I completely agree with you. Does anyone else have definitions of intervene? Yeah.
Regulatory action taken by the EU in order to affect decisions made by Syria regarding social matters.
Wow. Okay. Again, too many words in the resolution are used in your definition, so you don't want to use EU or in Syria or something like that, right? You want intervene to mean to affect social. Did you say it again? To affect social.
Social matters.
Social matters? Okay. I'd have to think about that. There's a better term for that. But you would only have that subsection, and you would probably, what are you trying to get with that definition?
I don't want to talk about, that one I wouldn't want to talk about troops. I won't want to talk about probably sanctions, like she was saying.
Okay.
So I'm saying that they're probably going to say something about putting actual people there.
Okay. All right. That's fine. I have a question for you. Do you think that an app that doesn't put troops on the ground wouldn't also meet your definition?
It might, yeah.
Yeah. So, not that I think that it's wrong. I think strategically, I could see an app being like, "Yep, we do that," and the judge being like, "Yep, they do that," and then kind of lost a lot of weight to where you wanted the debate to be. If you wanted to define intervene in kind of that social sanctions context, I would say, intervene means to interfere with the with government operations, distinct from use of force, right? So if we talk about intervention versus force is not synonymous terms. So the EU should use force in Syria as opposed to intervention or intervene. Those are different terms. So you can draw delineations there and then make limits and grounds arguments as to why your definition of intervene is more contextually accurate. Again, that's going to be very debatable, but I can definitely see you wanting to have the sanctions debate. All right, so let's see what the app read. How's your definition function now? I picked this for a variety of reasons. I've seen this happen twice, like in the back of the room.
I have a quick question.
Yep.
So like in this case, I'm quite confused as to like what the function of the topicality strategy would be relative to the resolution itself. Because like intervene is a broad term, and like
Yes.
when we're preparing this, are we making the assumption that, or at least I made the assumption that the other team is gonna prep a plan based on like a military intervention. So our goal is to prep for all the alternatives that the other.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in general, I'm giving the pre-round prep lecture that you might want to come to later. In general, when I'm prepping my teams, I prep both sides on the op. So I'll provide one definition for one strategy and another definition for another strategy. I'll provide two disads, one that links one way, one that links another way, just to make sure that they don't get screwed out of not having a strategy going into the round. That's why I recommend having modular definitions. So one definition is for military support, one definition is for sanctions, right? And then you just pick the one that they are not, right? So if they did intervention, I'd read the sanctions one. If they read the sanctions one, I'd read the military one. Because you don't know what they're going to do, right?
You know, other than, I guess since we're just focusing on the realm of the topicality, is this in some way not directly meeting the resolution because this is like an FX topicality because of the fact that it's just will offer, meaning that Assad doesn't necessarily have to take it, therefore the resolution requires the solvency of Assad offering or accepting the offer?
I think that argument can definitely be made. I think the argument can also be made it is a direct intervention in the way in which Syria functions because they are intervening in the way that the government is trying to operate. I do agree with you though.
Yeah.
But that's not what I'm trying to point out in this example.
Okay.
But yes, you are correct. So why is this problematic?
Because they're intervening. I mean, if they're offering Assad asylum, then they meet some of the definitions of intervening that we've discussed, but
Right.
it's not in Syria. They're
Right.
taking him out of Syria, so the in part
Yep.
is the issue now.
So how do you define in? This is one of those instances where you probably did not prep that T,
Right.
right?
So in, we would probably want to define that as the inside the borders of the country of Syria.
The EU is operating within Syria.
Within the nation state of Syria.
Yes, yeah.
Yes.
You could get away from that argument by saying that like diplomatic intervention is the best way to go, because that way that is diplomatic. Like,
But you can do a limit standard
Well,
on them.
Yeah. I mean, we're getting into the how to answer T.
Yeah.
oh, sorry.
No, it's totally fine. I would say that diplomatic and winning that definition on intervention is gonna be difficult. It's gonna be hard.
So we would be altering our T to then say that they're taking away our neg ground by no longer having an effect in
An
Syria.
action in Syria. Because let's face it, you probably have a disad based on, some political party in Syria, some, arguments about why airstrikes kill civilians, stuff like that, right? I mean, you're not gonna have stuff on just getting Assad out of there, like, fly G4 down, load him on a plane, load him back, right? I mean, like, that's, not kind of debate you wanna be having.